Delivering your message. The research says that oftentimes when people judge presentations, this is one of the top things that they're looking at. Now, as an ethical communicator, this shouldn't be your top concern, but as somebody communicating in the business world, you need to understand this does really matter. So here are your guided lecture notes for today. I'm going to be talking about nonverbals, question and answers at the end of the presentation, and then a little bit about visual aids. So let's start with delivery and nonverbals. In this section, I'll talk about presenting in person to an audience, but also present some tips on how to talk if you're online. Your delivery is the combination of verbal and nonverbal communication skills that you use to present in the speech. Nonverbal communication is anything communicated that doesn't involve words. So that could be eye contact, volume, gestures, what you're wearing, even movement, just to name a few. Good delivery makes your speech compelling and memorable, and it makes you compelling and memorable, period. What do you want people to remember? The content of your speech, but how do you do that? You have to engage your audience with delivery. The more you do that, the more they're going to pay attention. The more attention you have, the better odds for retention. So let's look at delivery related to some public speaking that you've probably seen before, TED Talks. In 2015, a human behavior consultancy called The Science of People conducted a study to answer the question, well, all TED Talks are pretty good. What makes some great? They had 700 volunteers rate hundreds of hours of TED Talks looking for specific nonverbal and body language patterns. Here's what they learned. First, it's not what you say, it's how you say it. The researchers asked some coders to watch the videos without sound and some with sound. They came up with essentially the same scores. It doesn't matter what they were saying. When they talked about charisma, credibility, intelligence, the scores were the same, whether or not they could actually hear the people. Second, they found a correlation between the number of hand gestures and the number of views. From this finding, they hypothesized that gestures prompt more engagement and make for more interesting TED Talks. Third, flexibility itself is good. So if you have a vocal variety, you're going to get better ratings on charisma and credibility. Don't be monotone. And fourth, smile. The longer a speaker smiled, the higher their perceived intelligence. Smiling makes you look smarter. Finally, you have 7 seconds to make an impression. The study found that people had largely formed their opinion about a speaker based on the first 7 seconds. So you really need to start your presentation strong. And in fact, you need to look strong and in charge before you start speaking. Think about how much you say in the first 7 seconds of a speech. Not very much. Most of that impression is based on nonverbals. When we are speaking, we want to make sure our delivery is appropriate. Oops, go back here. Appropriate. To do that, think about what the audience wants and cares about from a speech. We need to meet the expectations and norms of the presentation. That means meeting the length expectation, having appropriate delivery and visual aids, knowing what kind of energy we should bring. It's best to err on the side of professional because you can always relax the presentation more in your delivery. But it's difficult to enhance the professionalism of what you're saying on the visual aid in the spur of the moment. Finally, think about the setting and the size of the audience, the layout of the room, where the visual aid, all of that impacts your presentation. Knowing that ahead of time is really helpful. When I'm teaching in a classroom, one thing I do before the first day of class is look at the classroom. So I know how much room I have to move around, how much interaction I can ask for my audience, how big my visual aid looks like. In the case of web presentations, that setting impacts how you present. You have to think of how your slides will look on a computer screen. And then what makes it a lot more harder is how would that look on a phone? But also consider technical things like lighting, your computer's capabilities. My laptop is overheated, so I've had to switch to a different computer. All of that are things you need to understand with setting and size that change when you go online. And with an online presentation, think about background. Do you want to show where you're at? Is it clean enough to be presentable? Will it be too distracting? If you want to hide your unmade bed, click. So this is Dr. Lookadoo. She took pictures for our class. She did this, and clearly she has blurred out the background. Now, some people actually do not prefer this. They would prefer some kind of neutral background like this, which is done on Microsoft Teams. And you definitely want to avoid something like this. So the focus needs to be on the presenter, not what is happening behind them with the rabbit and the carrot. So best thing you could do is actually just have a blank wall, something behind them that looks really neutral. Now let's talk about delivery related to your gestures and your body. Gestures are a wonderful tool to drive home important points, but can be really distracting if used in the wrong way. Limit distracting gestures. That means don't put your hand in your pocket. Don't be holding your phone. Don't consistently play with your hair and your clothes. If you're not sure what to do with your hands, use them to illustrate points in the visual aid. So if you're talking about a statistic that says 5% are still listening to this lecture video after 3 minutes, hold up your hand to show the number 5 and emphasize your point. Hopefully the statistic's wrong, but here we are. If you're talking about a graphic on a visual aid, point to it. That gesture draws your audience to what you want them to look at. What is great about video presentations is we can and should still incorporate gestures. In video presentations, we have these limited nonverbals, so gestures matter even more. Pay attention to the way you use your hands. We will use our hands similarly to the way we use them in person. Don't just hide them, but you want to use them to emphasize points. Counting is probably the easiest and most impactful way to do that. The cursor can also serve as an extension as a gesture to point or to highlight. If you're presenting in a lectern, be really careful. In short, don't use it. They limit engagement. They're really only appropriate for super formal settings. Otherwise, people tend to hide behind them and just sink back behind them. I will tell you the one time, if you ever have me for an in-class I will be using the lectern as if I'm sick and I just need something to slouch on. You don't want to do that unless you're, at school and ill, which really you should stay home. All right, so next, remember, people are watching even when you are not speaking. So if you're doing a group presentation and you are standing off to the side because Joe in your group is talking, you are not suddenly invisible. So don't fold your arms. Don't look at your phone. Don't look disgustedly at Joe. You want to look like, oh, Joe is the most important and interesting person in the room, and be engaged. That signals to your audience who is the person they should be listening to, Joe. All right. Finally, you want to plan speaker placement and movement in advance. We're going to give you an idea called the speaker's triangle in this video. So if you're with a group, the person speaking should step forward when it is their turn. So what's the big benefit of movement? When presenting in person, movement's going to add energy to a presentation, and by movement I mean like stepping out of your spot, in forward to the room, closer to the people who are listening. Moving intentionally in a speech allows you to capture attention and interest from the audience. It shows you're confident, and I don't constantly move. I'm talking about intentional movement that is engaging but not distracting. So here's our speaker's triangle. It is a great example of intentional movement that engages the audience and is so simple to do. So what you do is you start facing the audience and you introduce your main idea. Then you move to point A, and from point A you make your first point. Then you move to B and you make your second point. You return to that center position that's closer to the audience and you make your conclusion or your third point. The triangle can be modified for the structure of your speech or the number of points you're making, and even for the room layout. You want to make sure you don't block your visual aid, really important there, or your group members, so you may have to compress the triangle or change the shape a little. The triangle doesn't matter as much as the intentional movement matters. All right, so here's an activity you can choose to do or not do. I clearly won't know. So the idea here is stand up, or even if you're sitting, like try and sit up a little bit, maybe towards the edge of the chair. Now stand or sit in a happy posture. I'm doing this even while I'm talking. You note how you feel and look when you're happy. How are your feet arranged? What do your arms look like? What does your back or spine look like? Mine was a much better position when I sat up in a happy posture. Now sit sad. You slumped, right? Did you hear my voice go low? So now you stand like you're about to give a presentation posture. What do you look like? Where are your hands and your arms? So what I'm asking you to do is this. This is an experiment published in the Journal of Behavior Therapy and Experimental Psychiatry. They reported that nonverbals, like how we walk, can impact mood. So you want to be so careful with your body language, such as posture and stance. It impacts your mood as a presenter. We want to feel strong and confident. How do we do that? In a live speech in person, you stand with your legs shoulder width apart, arms at your side, elbows slightly bent. Your hands should be kind of open in front of you. Showing your palms is a really positive thing. And don't cross your arms. I know it's just such a bad habit. I do it too. But that can make you look defensive. It can make you look closed off. So here we have Dr. Lookadoo again helping us out with how this looks like when you're on camera. If you're presenting on camera, you want to sit at the front edge of your chair. This will help you improve your posture. This is actually a trick news anchors do. Posture is important because it signals engagement, but it looks more appropriate and professional. When you're sitting at the edge, like she is in the green outlined picture, still make sure that you have enough distance from the camera that you're framed well. Straighten your back, but drop those shoulders, relax them down. And this is a good way to sit for online interviews too. Sitting back in your chair, so slouching back like in the red framed image, makes it look like you're just a little bit less engaged, but probably a lot more comfortable. All right, next we have eye contact. In American culture, now understand this is culturally specific, and good eye contact in American culture is seen as a sign of honesty and respect. So when you don't make eye contact, people can get suspicious or doubt your credibility or think you're weak. Eye contact is also a sign of confidence. Now, I know other cultures have different norms of what eye contact signals, so when you are working abroad, when you are in a really diverse team, you want to be aware that the expectations can be a little bit different. That's in terms of eye contact, but really all nonverbals, and particularly hand gestures. With eye contact, don't talk to your notes, the sky, the wall, your visual aid. It's okay to glance at your notes or make sure the visual aid is on the right side, but you want your eye contact to primarily focus on the audience. Don't focus on one audience member. You want to really talk to the whole room of people. You'll be surprised how often this happens where students start talking and then they stare down me. Don't do that. It will only make you more nervous because I'll be taking some weird note like, oh, that was an awesome hand gesture, and you'll think I'm writing, this person sucks, and you will be thrown. So just do not watch your professor when you're presenting. Try and scan the entire room. All right, what you want to do with eye contact is talk to your audience. Pan the room, pick a side as you walk and talk more slowly. Move your head over, sweeping your eyes across the room. When you hit the other side, start sweeping back across the other. A great way to think about this is if you've ever been to a concert, and like a big stadium style concert, and there's this performer on stage and it feels like that person sees you. That person cannot see a thing. That person is blinded by the lights and it's just noise and chaos usually. So how does that person make it look like they can see you? They're making a connection by looking at the audience, by panning across the room, by acting or even pretending that they see all people in the audience who they like. Now, eye contact online is a little bit different. Of course, you can't look into people's eyes. It's still a good way, though, to signal confidence and credibility. So in informal web meetings, so a group meeting, you're collaborating, people are talking, it's okay to look at the screen while you talk. So follow the agenda if it's on there, or read other people's body language. But for video conference calls where you or your team members are specifically presenting to other people on the call, that's a different scenario. Because you are the one speaking, you want to look at the web camera lens so it'll look like you're making direct eye contact. That is a really strong way to increase engagement and credibility. It's subtle but important. Next is Vocalics. It's a fancy term communication researchers use to refer to nonverbal uses of your voice. So nonverbal covers everything aside from words. Is the key definition there. So your volume, if you're whispering, your rate, your tone, your pitch, all of those are nonverbal aspects of your voice. So our Vocalics can either enhance our speech or help engage our audience, or do the opposite. It can really hinder you. So in person and online, consider a number of things. Some considerations that are pretty obvious are making sure you have the appropriate volume. You want people to be able to hear what you're saying. You want to limit your fillers. So fillers are what you see on the right, like, you know, yeah. So typically they occur when somebody's nervous or when they haven't practiced, or we can just get into the habit of using them. I find I actually use them the most when I am tired. So the best way to get rid of fillers is to practice your speech out loud, or also to record yourself and then count out how many times am I saying this. Next, you want to try and vary your rate and your tone. So rate's the speed at which you speak, and the main issue is speakers go way too fast. I've had students practice their presentation to an empty classroom and have a pretty good rate, but get in front of their peers, get nervous, and then start speaking through everything, and to be careful of how fast you're speaking if you need to slow down and take a deep breath. All right, so you don't want to sound like that. You want to take a deep breath, start fast maybe, but just breathe and out. And then you'll get less nervous and slow down naturally. There's brain scans they've done that prove it. But just be aware of the rate issue. Every now and then I'll have people who will speak too slowly in class where they think they will talk like this with lots of pauses, and they think that they're being measured and not going too quickly. But really that's not the case, right? What's going to happen is that then people are going to lose interest. You need to be careful, whichever tone you're picking, whatever rate you're going for, just make sure that it's varied. And if you're just speaking like I'm speaking right now, you're going to lose your audience. So change it up, keep it up for more engagement. All right, finally, it's okay to pause. If you lose your place or make an error, take a pause, collect yourself, and then keep going. If you want to even just use this presentation that I'm recording right now, I've made a couple of errors, I heard them, and then I just kept going. It draws so much more attention to it if you stop and you apologize, so just do not do that. All right, so we're finished talking about nonverbals in general, but I do have a few more tips for online presentations. First off, really important here, frame yourself well. So how you appear on screen is important. So again, thanks to Dr. Lookadoo for being our guinea pig here. I've been in a lot of web meetings lately, and I am astounded how people are not framing themselves. All three of those red boxes right there are completely real life presentation. And I will say, let me double down on this. The one that's there down at the bottom where it's the top of the head, I've seen that, but also the person sitting outside in their backyard, like it was crazy. So you want to try and frame your head and shoulders like in the green outline image. Elevate your computer or laptop if you can. Right now I have my webcam, you can't see me, but I have my webcam up about 2 inches above the height of my head by propping up my monitor, so it goes a little bit down, but not so far down that you're staring at the top of somebody's head. Next, you want to think about your lighting. So the reason I'm not recording right now is because it is dark, it is late here, and I know that I'd end up looking a lot like the one on the right there where Dr. Lookadoo has her thumbs down. So consider if you can be seen well. The red outline image is actually the real life how Dr. Lookadoo's office looks, and the green one is after she turns on a really cheap ring light. But there's lots of different ways you can do that. Even just angling a desk lamp will work to add lighting. Just my problem with that is I feel so blinded. So best case scenario, in front of a window or with a lamp in prep. All right, questions and answers. So remember, we've already talked about conclusion to speeches. With a question and answer, if you're asked to do this, be sure you do this. Is the simple thing. You want to picture that you've just finished an excellent presentation. You followed this 5-finger model, right? You do your conclusion. You have this residual message. Delivery is superb. And then you walk off. So again, you can't do that. You have to think about when do we ask questions and how do we do it. So make sure you're separating your conclusion from your Q&A session. So conclude strongly, allow for applause, and then say, I'll open the floor for questions. It's a good idea to have a slide that states it's Q&A time. You want to think about what are they going to ask? What might be confusing? What might they want more detail on? And don't just think about those. You want to practice your responses to them. Like I already mentioned, you need to decide if and when you're taking questions and tell the audience when you're opening for questions. I actually think it's a way more powerful move if you ask for questions and say, after we talk through the questions, we'll deliver our conclusions. So do Q&A and then do conclusions. Now, I'll warn you, if you do that in JSON, people are going to be confused because they're so used to a conclusion and then Q&A. So just sort of tuck that away for when you are doing presentations. All right. So like I mentioned, you need to decide if and when. So you might start off saying we're open for questions. After people ask a question, you repeat the question. So you say, Amira just asked about when is the best time for doing Q&As, and repeating it will help to show that you're listening. You want to view these questions as an opportunity to reinforce your main points and key takeaways. So if somebody says, let's say we're doing this presentation and I said, does anyone have any questions right now? And they said, yes, can you explain double speak from a couple of weeks ago? What I would need to do as a speaker is pull back and talk about what was this about? What are we talking about in chapter 11? And then push it for anything that is irrelevant or off topic to be answered later. You want to think about alternating speakers. If one person takes all of the questions, it's going to seem like that one person is the only person who's prepared. You don't want to get defensive. People can be rude. They can ask really questions that critique your work. So just be polite, professional, and really their audience's goodwill can be based on how defensive you get just with one question. They point out a flaw, and I will say, if you pointed out a flaw in my class, I set a deadline wrong, I'm going to own it and smile and move on. These things happen. It is not a critique of your ability or your intelligence. It's just a small error that you can fix. All right, finally, here, in with a summary and appreciation. So after they ask questions, you say, thanks for having us. That's all the time we have for questions. Thank you for your time. And now we move on. All right, so now that we've talked about Q&A, let's go on to our last big subject, which is visual aids. So let's take a look at these two handouts. Which one looks like a cleaner design? If you're not sure, think about it this way. Clean design is something that allows the audience to glance at something and get a lot of information. So which one gets the information fastest? Well, yeah, the one on the right. It changes the emphasis by having larger titles. It makes the reading easier by changing alignment, and does a little bit great use of negative space too. So good visual aids should focus on the needs of the audience. So by making the handout cleaner, clearer, easier to read, the audience can get the information a whole lot easier. Clean design supports visual thinking and allows the audience to get more information with less effort. So remember, people are cognitive misers. Our brain likes shortcuts and skimming information, so good visual aids help us do that. You may have seen this before. So this is a classic activity with this. You read the list of colors out loud. If you wanted to pause and do it, you're only concentrating on a single task. That's not so bad. But then you say the names of the colors. All right, you can still do that, right? And then the third step, where if you've seen this before, is now you need to say the names of the colors or say the words, but ignoring the fact that the information is mixed there. This is an illustration of the Stroop Effect. So what does it teach us? That delay you experienced in the third column is because the incongruent word and color interferes with our natural thought process. Our brains move so fast that we want to say the color we read, not what we see. That incongruent stimuli throws off our natural thought process. Think about this with visual aids. You want to keep our mixed messages to a minimum and shape an aid that works with how the audience would normally think about something. That means visually group things together that go together, keep headings and fonts consistent, make things easy to understand with minimal effort, and just again, that's clear, concise, easy to skim. Text is a really important component with visual aids. So this is a common rule you'll hear. This is the 6x6 rule. This is not a bad rule. So that's the idea that you keep your slide limited to 6 words per line and 6 words per slide. It's not a bad idea. That's actually not super research based though, because what will happen is people will take the 6x6 rule and just abuse it, and you do not want to see a slide deck with 20 slides where they're all 6x6. It is incredibly boring. Period. Boring. So don't do that. You want your audience to focus on what you're saying verbally. If you put a lot of text on a slide, you're asking them to choose between listening and reading. Or if it's an audience that's translating, if we have people where English is their second or third or fourth language, they might need to be reading, translating while listening, translating, and that's really asking a lot. So a couple of things here. Well, I just did the last one wrong there. So use keywords, not sentences. You want to introduce elements one by one, so like that, and try not to click ahead. And then think about font size. So is there a right size, wrong size? Back row, what could the back row read if we had a row? Well, gosh, that just depends on the room. It depends on the size of the screen. There is not a right or wrong answer with font size. It's what's right or wrong for that context, for that audience, for that information that's on the screen. So with good visual aids, speakers aren't just going to think about font size, it's the type of the font. how or whether or not they use animation. I would say only use it if you want to introduce points one at a time, and on the same slide, be subtle. No flying, no turning in place, no blinking. Just have the information appear, disappear, and no noise. I once listened to a speech where the presenter introduced points one at a time with a gunshot sound. It was even worse, like just in person. It was in the Davidson Auditorium. And I just nearly jumped out of my seat the first time I heard it. And then that's all I remember about that presentation was the bang of the points coming onto the screen. It was truly awful. So the goal of animations is to support your presentation. Do not overtake it as the main event. You'll also want to think about color. Is it appropriate for your slides? Is it readable? Is it culturally appropriate? In the workplace, your company might have a set of branded slides. Like here at UT Dallas, we have a whole lot of green and orange. Use that. But you also want to think about readability, what's consistent. For me, I think about the orange and green, which looks really fun in a classroom on the big screens. But on YouTube, it starts looking just really orange and green, and it doesn't convert that well from Mac to Apple. So here we are. Try to fill the slide so it doesn't look empty or lopsided. So this one has a pretty good balance of text to image. And the image there really helps create entrance and balance it all out. All right, so you can see there, no image. Oh, it's so sad looking. So including the picture and create some entrance, it balances out. It doesn't mean much there. That's just some stock photography that's free online. But I think it's a pretty good example of how just a little can add a lot. So let's use an example, and actually let's pick on the executive MBA team here at JSOM. So these are amazing, smart people, but here's what they had originally. Now, this isn't a bad slide. Now, if you read through it though, you might start to think, well, something feels a little off here. And part of this is because the template's not great in terms of colors. Orange and green, like I said, just don't show up that well across multiple different screens, but we had the template, we decided to work with it. So some things you might have thought odd were the plane icon, the picture and bullets were unaligned, the listing kind of is weird. It could have been easier to read. So here's how they started to change it. They emphasized the design. They wanted to keep the plane because it aligned with their icons across the other presentations. So we moved it over, took that first bullet point that said network with the sister program, used it as a heading, and then moved it because that was the big takeaway they wanted the students to know about that international study tour. So if you look at the bullet points, we'll go back here. It didn't make sense in the list, but they detailed the trip. So clicking forward here, we made those bullets easier to read and skim by taking out the word include, making it into a category, added space, and you'll see boxes now around the text and the image. Those boxes are to show we check the alignment. So the text and the image are centered with each other to create more balance in the slide. The ultimate goal was to lessen that visual confusion we talked about with the Stroop Effect. The new slide is easier to skim and easier and more quickly understood because the elements make visual sense together. All right. So we talked about a lot today. So you've done the reading, you've watched this video about chapter 11, and hopefully you understand what's appropriate in terms of delivery. You know how to handle a question and answer session, and then finally you know what goes into essentially a good visual aid. So you've got the tools to make a great presentation, and hopefully that will be helpful to you, but also to your audience.